My parents, who I parent to, told me to move out so their favorite son could take my place, but they still wanted me to keep paying rent. I packed my things and left the next day, cutting off all contact. Now they keep calling me, saying I'm the worst daughter ever because they can't handle their mortgage payments anymore. So, I'm an 18-year-old girl looking for some advice on this family drama involving my mom, dad, and my older brother, who I'll refer to as Brad. To give you some background, I'm the second child in a family full of overachievers. Both my parents are college professors, and my brother Brad, who's 6 years older, has always been the star of the family. He was the miracle baby since my mom had a tough time getting pregnant, and he's always excelled at everything. When I came along, the expectations for me were sky high because of him. I'm a really kind and generous person, and I love getting involved in social activities. I might not be the top student or an amazing athlete, but I know I'm a talented artist. Art has been my passion since I was little. My family has struggled to accept that just because I have different interests, it doesn't mean I'm any less capable. They've labeled me the failure child, and it's been so obvious that even my extended family has noticed a difference in how I'm treated. I remember one Christmas when I was 5, I excitedly grabbed the biggest present. Even though my mom kept pushing me to let it go, I held on tight to the box, which led my dad to grab it from me in front of everyone. I started crying, and they tried to calm me down with a smaller gift before giving the bigger box to Brad. He ended up with a telescope. Well, I got yet another dress. Seriously, I had like 100 of those by then. The next day, my grandparents sent me a dollhouse, realizing how things had played out, and they've been my support ever since. My brother had just graduated high school when I turned 13. He got accepted into a good college, and my parents decided to move us to a nicer house in the suburbs, a really fancy area. I wasn't too thrilled about the move, since it meant my grandparents would be even farther away. But I had no choice, so I went along with it. My parents had saved a good chunk of their money for Brad's education, and they took out a loan for the new house. Brad and I didn't have a bad relationship, but we weren't super close either. Still, I wanted to give him a watch with my saved-up pocket money as a congratulatory gift. He smiled when he saw it, but then my dad swooped in and took it away because he had bought Brad a fancy branded one. Brad didn't say a word, but it really hurt me. From that moment on, I decided to keep to myself. Dinner time became a nightmare, with my parents only talking about how amazing Brad was doing in college. The constant comparisons really got under my skin, and I found myself crying to my grandparents almost every night. I had tried to stay with them instead of my parents before, but my folks thought it would spoil me, so that plan was shot down. Now that I turned 14, it was legal for me to work, but instead of celebrating my birthday, my parents decided it was time for a life lesson and suggested I get a part-time job to help with expenses since money was tight after moving into the new house. They seemed to have plenty of cash to cover Brad's expenses, but suddenly, when I hit the legal working age, things changed. I felt pretty isolated but kept my mouth shut because I knew it wouldn't change anything. We moved into the new place a few months later. I landed a job at a bookstore and was actually making more than most people in that role because I was putting in extra hours. I shared the news with my grandparents, and they were thrilled that I was becoming financially independent, but they also hoped I could move out soon for a brighter future. Meanwhile, Brad was stirring up trouble. He got into a relationship and started skipping classes, which only added to my parents' frustration. A week later, they called me in for a chat. They explained that finances had been tight since buying the house and that they had to support Brad too. They knew I was making decent money from my part-time job, so they suggested I start paying rent to help out. They claimed it was a way to teach me about the real world without overwhelming me. I didn't respond and just headed to my room. My grandparents called my parents to scold them for how they were treating me after I shared what happened. They ended up having a huge argument that lasted a couple of hours. Eventually, my parents came to my room and told me I needed to either start paying rent next month or find somewhere else to live. I initially thought about moving in with my grandparents, but it was too far from school, and I didn't want to be a burden on them since they were getting older. Even though they insisted I come stay with them, I started paying my parents' rent. I would have been happy to help them out financially if they had just asked nicely, but their condescending attitude really soured our relationship. I was just counting down the days until school ended so I could leave their house. I felt completely disconnected from my own family. The next couple of years were pretty quiet for me. I kept to myself and stopped having dinner with my parents. School was going well, and as I approached my final year of high school, I could see myself getting into a good art school. My parents didn't seem to care as long as they were getting their rent each month. They were more focused on Brad, who had just graduated from college but didn't want to come home because of his girlfriend. His life took a nosedive after getting into that relationship, and his grades suffered, which hurt his job prospects. They were really pushing him to return home, but he went off the radar for 2 days, which made them panic. When he finally called back, he dropped the bombshell that he had married his girlfriend in Vegas. The following weeks were rough, with constant arguments erupting in our house over the situation. Brad was trying to get my parents to meet his wife before they judged her, but all they did was complain about how he was embarrassing our family. Honestly, I couldn't care less, so I started spending more time at my friends' places. Only my grandparents were in the loop about what was going on. Eventually, my parents met Brad and his wife, but they were super cold. After they left, my parents just went on and on about her, and I thought it was pretty sad. I decided to stay out of it since my senior year of high school had kicked off, and I wasn't about to let their drama mess with my focus. I ended up crashing at my grandparents' house for weeks because my home life was toxic and I had just turned 18. Things took a turn right before finals when Brad and his wife started having issues, largely thanks to our parents meddling, and they ended up deciding on a divorce. My parents were thrilled and blamed all of Brad's problems on his ex. They even asked me to fund their trip to bring him back, but I flat out refused. They weren't happy about it, but managed to scrape together some money from somewhere else. Oh, and I forgot to mention that our new place only had 2 bedrooms. So when Brad came back, my parents wanted me to move to the living room since I was leaving for college soon anyway. They clearly didn't care about my needs or how this would impact my studies, they just wanted their favorite son to have everything he needed to start over. Since I was paying rent, I told them that this arrangement was totally unacceptable, especially with finals around the corner. They told me that if I wasn't happy with the situation, I could just go back to my grandparents' place like I had been doing for the last few months. The catch was that I'd still have to pay rent since most of my stuff was still at their house. I thought Brad would say something about how unfair this was, but he just sat there, not reacting at all to how our parents were treating me. It was hard to wrap my head around how harsh my family was being, but I decided to stay strong. I headed straight to my room, grabbed what I needed, and called a cab to get out of there. As I was leaving, I told them they could do whatever they wanted with the stuff I left behind because I wasn't about to give them a dime to support their kid who couldn't get his act together. I had already ordered an Uber, so I stormed out and called my grandparents on the way to fill them in on everything. They welcomed me with open arms and made sure I felt safe. My dad had called them, trying to find out if I was there so they could come over and make a scene, but my grandparents covered for me and told him I wasn't around, asking him not to bother them. The next morning, I noticed a few missed calls from my parents, but as the week went on, the calls dwindled, showing me they didn't really care about how I was doing. So, I decided to cut them off completely. I focused on studying for my finals and ended up doing really well. I also applied to colleges and was waiting for the results. One day, when I got back to my grandparents' house, I was shocked to find my parents waiting for me. They, who I was paying rent to, asked me to move out but still keep paying rent so their precious son could move in. I packed my bags and left the next day, cutting off all contact. Now, my phone won't stop buzzing with calls from my parents, who are calling me the worst daughter ever because they can't keep up with their mortgage payments anymore. The moment they saw me, my mom burst into tears and my dad, sounding both angry and sad, started laying into me, saying I abandoned them when they needed me most and that I should have helped them out financially. They were actually at my grandparents' place asking for cash because, after I stopped paying rent, they were struggling to make their mortgage payments. Now they're trying to guilt trip me, saying family is everything and I've turned my back on them. Update 1. Huge thanks to everyone who commented on my original post and got where I'm coming from. I totally agree with you all, my family has been really harsh and I stand by my choice to leave. So, picking up where I left off, my parents went to my grandparents, begging for money to cover their mortgage. My grandparents were open to hearing them out, but quickly changed their minds when they saw my parents blaming me for their problems. When my dad called me the worst daughter, my grandpa snapped and gave it right back to him. He told my dad he had been a terrible parent, expecting way too much from me since I was a kid. Grandpa kept going, pointing out how everyone in the family felt sorry for me because of how I was treated growing up. My parents tried to defend themselves, but they were quickly silenced when reminded of how they kicked me out to bring back their son, Brad, who they don't see as a burden, but somehow I was. Then my grandpa dropped a truth bomb on them. He mentioned that over the years, he's watched me blossom into an amazing person, so he decided to leave me my parents' share of the property in his will. At that moment, my parents looked completely shocked. Realizing they were out of options, they started to fake tears and tried to persuade me to give up my share. She pointed out that karma had finally caught up with them for how they treated me, and she had no regrets about it. My parents then started pleading with me to talk to my grandparents. They never once apologized for their hurtful remarks, but still expected me to be nice to them, just because we were family. Since I've always been pretty easygoing, they thought I'd be forgiving, but seeing how hard my grandparents were fighting for me gave me the courage to stand up for myself. I told them they didn't deserve a kid like me, and maybe they should look for support from the child they chose to ruin. Suddenly, it got super quiet, and then they erupted, hurling insults and saying they wished I'd never been born. My grandparents had enough and told them to leave before they called the cops. My parents stormed out, all flustered. I broke down in tears, thanking my grandparents for being the real parents I needed and that I didn't want their money after everything. They comforted me and said they had made their decision long ago when they saw how selfish my parents were. They had even set aside some money for Brad since he was their grandchild, but there was no way my parents could touch it. They encouraged me not to dwell on it and to focus on my future, which I did. As I mentioned earlier, I had applied to a few colleges and luckily got accepted into the best one. After chatting with my grandparents, I realized just how wealthy they were and they insisted on covering my tuition. I hesitated for a moment, but eventually, I agreed. I was set to leave in a month when the new session kicked off. As for my parents and Brad, I hadn't heard a peep from them, and honestly, I was relieved. For the first time, I felt completely confident in myself. I was really glad I decided to cut ties with them because toxic people can really drag you down. Update 2. I thought the drama had finally settled, but I was totally wrong. Since my last update a week ago, I hadn't heard from my family until one day I got an email from Brad. He said he didn't have my number and wanted to meet up to talk. At first, I was hesitant since we never really had a close relationship, but I pushed my worries aside, remembering I had my grandparents' support. I replied yes, and we set a lunch date at a local cafe. I arrived at the cafe before Brad and started second-guessing my choice to meet him. Just as I was about to bail, he showed up looking pretty worn out with some stubble. It was clear he wasn't doing well. The first few minutes were a bit awkward, but I decided to break the ice, and then he opened up, spilling some serious tea. He mentioned that the house was a disaster since my parents found out we weren't getting anything from our grandparents. At first, everyone was pointing fingers at me, but then the focus shifted to my parents bickering with each other. Brad, who was already dealing with a messy divorce, couldn't take it anymore and moved in with a friend. The day before, he came home and was shocked by how the place looked. It was a total disaster, like a guy's place that hadn't seen a broom in ages. Neither of our parents was working, instead, they were just lounging around the house, day drinking. Brad decided to clean up, but our parents brushed it off, saying it was pointless since they were about to lose the house anyway. I felt super uncomfortable listening to all this. I had been through worse situations because of my parents and sometimes Brad, and the only people I could turn to were my grandparents. I didn't want to come off as unsympathetic, so I just nodded along. Brad took that as me feeling for him and kept going, eventually spilling about his personal life. He mentioned that he had secretly met up with his ex-wife a few months ago, and they ended up in the same hotel room. Then he dropped the bomb that she called him yesterday to say she was pregnant and wanted to keep the baby while trying to get back together. That's when he hit me with the real reason for our chat. He asked if I could share a bit of the money I got from our grandparents with our parents and him, thinking it might help them get their act together and give him a fresh start as a soon-to-be dad. He claimed he'd pay me back when he could and suggested I do this for my brother out of family loyalty. I was just sitting there, stunned by his nerve. I always thought he just needed someone to listen, but it turns out he was only after cash. That's when I snapped and decided to be a bit petty. I reminded him that I've been on my own my whole life, and I distinctly remember him just standing there when our parents were kicking me out. He better not tarnish the meaning of family with his dirty talk and shamelessly ask me for money. I also pointed out that our parents were the real reason behind his divorce, meddling and filling his head with nonsense, the same parents he was begging for money from. Before he could respond, I left my share of the bill and walked out. I headed back to my grandparents' place and filled them in on everything. They thought Brad was different, but as they say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Even though my grandparents are still worried about his ex-wife and kid, I feel like I messed up by even meeting with Brad. But there's no way I'm going to deal with him any longer. Update 3. It's been a week since my last update, and I'll be moving to college in 2 weeks. So, last time I mentioned how I put Brad in his place when he asked me for money. Everything I'm sharing now is what I heard from my grandparents, who got it from my aunt, who heard it straight from Brad. After I brought up our parents' role in his divorce, he went home fuming and confronted them. They tried to calm him down, insisting they did what they did for his own good. But he wasn't having it and decided to cut ties with them for good. They even called my grandparents to try and stop him from leaving, but my grandparents told them about the ex-wife's pregnancy, making it clear there was no way to change his mind now. My parents had to leave their home because they couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments, and now they've moved to a pretty quiet area. From what I gather, Brad is staying at his ex-wife's place for now, trying to sort his life out. They might even consider getting back together once he's in a better spot. So, my parents, who I was paying rent to, asked me to move out so their favorite child could take my place. I packed up and left the next day, cutting off all contact. Now they keep calling me, saying I'm the worst daughter ever because they can't handle their mortgage anymore. This all happened recently, and I'm still pretty upset about it. After Brad left, my parents somehow figured it was me who spilled the beans to him and blamed me for their problems. They even went on Facebook to post some wild stuff, calling me an illegitimate child and a burden. They thought that would get them sympathy, but everyone who knew my childhood just slammed them in the comments, saying they didn't deserve a kid like me. The few people who didn't know the whole story called me up to tell me how ungrateful I was, and I told them that if they didn't know me, their opinions didn't matter at all. That really ticked some of them off, but honestly, I didn't care. What hurt the most was realizing how little my parents think of me. I always tried to be the person my parents wanted me to be, but they just ended up blaming me for all their problems. I vented to my grandparents about it, and they promised to help me escape the situation once I moved away for school. Now that their plan to tarnish my reputation backfired, they're trying to take legal action to reclaim the inheritance they lost. The family lawyer, who's good friends with my grandparents, gave my parents a serious wake-up call and told them to stop living in denial, which left them feeling pretty embarrassed. He then shared the whole thing with my grandpa, who turned it into a funny story for us. I doubt my parents will stop their antics anytime soon, but I'm just hoping things don't get worse for me before I leave. Once I'm out, I'll be completely done with them, and honestly, that's a pretty thrilling thought right now. Update 4. So here's my update after a month. I'm now settled into my college dorm and really enjoying this new chapter away from all the negativity. I've kept in touch with my grandparents, which is how I'm able to share this update. Before diving in, I want to address a question that's been popping up a lot. Many comments pointed out that my parents are professors and wondered how they could be struggling to pay the mortgage. Honestly, I think people are underestimating just how poor their financial planning has been. The new house we moved into was super expensive, way more than what they could actually afford. They thought they could cover their expenses with their savings, but they totally miscalculated, which is why they're in such a financial mess now. As for my parents, they've been trash talking me to everyone, but most people aren't buying it after seeing their Facebook post. Brad, on the other hand, moved back to our hometown after living with his ex-wife for just 2 weeks, hoping to find better opportunities. He took some cash from her and started looking for a place to stay, since he didn't want to return to my parents' house. My grandparents offered him a room until he landed a job, and he gladly accepted. When they asked about his future, he mentioned he still wanted to reconcile with his ex-wife for the sake of their family. My parents tried reaching out to him, but he told them to get their act together before trying to be part of his life. My grandparents told me they wanted to help Brad because they could see he was eager to turn things around, and they planned to give him some money once he found work. I didn't say much but trusted their judgment. A few days later, I went back to my grandparents' house to grab some stuff I had left behind. I also gave them a painting I made, and they insisted on paying me for it as a celebration of my first sale as an artist. I was really grateful and got a bit teary-eyed thinking about how my parents used to ask me for money when I was just a kid. My grandfather, upon hearing this, expressed how ridiculous he found it that my parents were charging me rent since they had no expenses besides groceries. I was confused and asked him what he meant, and he revealed that he had set up a fund for my education in brass since middle school, which covered most of our schooling and college costs, with my parents managing it. This was a total shock to me because I had always been told to start paying my own way to lighten my parents' load. I told my grandfather I had no clue about any of this, and he decided to confront my parents. Bragg was still around, having just returned from a day of job hunting. My grandma called my parents over, and what happened next was totally unexpected. When my parents arrived, Grandpa sat them down and asked about the education fund for me and Brad right in front of us. They tried to play it off, saying it was used as it should be, but when pressed about why I had to pay rent, they finally cracked. They confessed to spending all that money on their own fun and activities, never considering how it would impact us. I was shocked that my own parents could be so selfish. After hearing everything, I made it clear that I wanted nothing to do with them. Even if I ever decide to reconnect in the future, it will be entirely on my terms. The following day, while I was getting my stuff ready to head back to college, Bragg popped into my room and apologized for everything, saying he hadn't been the big brother I needed. He mentioned that I was still family to him and that he'd love for his kid to spend time with their aunt. I chose to forgive him and take small steps to build our relationship from scratch. My grandparents were thrilled to see us trying to mend things, and honestly, I can't imagine where I'd be without their support. So, I've decided to dedicate my first professional painting collection to them. Thank you for watching this video. For more content like this, subscribe. I post stories like this from across the internet.